All right, it's Dr. Feist again with the piggy banks, talking to you about the Nicomachean Ethics, still in Book 5. Now we're in Chapter 3. I've given you a bit of an overview of what to expect in the next few chapters. If you don't know what to expect, go back to the previous video and have a look at that. So in this video, I just want to make a few comments because, as I've mentioned several times, there's lots of distinctions going on here. It's very rich discussion, and we could spend a lot of time on this, but I think what's good enough is just to get the basic ideas of what Aristotle is talking about. So in this Book 5, Chapter 3, he's talking roughly about the notion of sharing of goods like honor, money, things like that by members of society. Public office, and I'm going to do a couple examples of public office, and how these things are shared. A couple of things to remember. How these things are shared, that is your principle of sharing, your principle of distribution. Principle, the basis of distribution, is going to give you the form of society. So this is a key one. The principle of distribution will give you the form of your society, the basic structure of it. So that's an important one. The manner of distribution is important too. So you've got the manner of distribution, but that's not as in Aristotle's view. We, again, don't just accept everything Aristotle's saying. You want to debate with him. He doesn't think it's that important. It's a lesser idea. But the key one is going to be the principle of distribution. All right, so in this now we're talking really about just kind of try and bring it back to our previous discussions. This is the notion of justice as, people getting fair shares and people not getting greedy or putting the brakes on people being greedy, because remember, that's the whole idea of law, according to Aristotle, is to curtail, bad behavior, and of course, as we saw in the broad sense, is to create good behavior, to make us virtuous. All right, so in this one is the justice of public deals. Really, you can think of it as kind of like between individuals of the state. How does the state sort of parcel things out? Well, in this notion of the justice of public deals, you have to have the principle of distribution. Basically, who qualifies? What's your basis for what goods? That's a really important one. Not necessarily how you give the goods out, but who qualifies for what goods. That's going to play an enormously important role in shaping the form of your society. All right, so who is going to qualify for for what goods? And of course, these are the distributable goods, right? Goods that can be distributed. Who qualifies for which ones? How is that going to work? The other one, the principle of the manner of distribution is how to select. From the qualified group. Okay? How's that going to work? So that's more of a procedural item, and and this can vary in a variety of ways, Aristotle thinks, and independently of the form of the state. So you could have you could allow, let's say, the manner of distribution to vary, keeping the principle of distribution constant, and you would keep the same form. The form really is dependent on the principle of distribution, not the manner of distribution. Now, if this sounds terribly abstract, I don't blame you for thinking that. So I'm going to do just a couple of fairly straightforward examples that should illustrate what's going on in this. So let's have a look at 3 examples. So in each case, I'm looking at the good being something like holding public office, right? And we all think that's pretty important. Basically, who gets to be a politician? Who gets to be a person of power? And when you think about it, hasn't that been the history of pretty well most countries is the struggles and whatnot to see who gets to hold power in society, who gets public office. So this is quite a prized good. And how do you distribute that, right, amongst your population? So what's your basis, right? What's your basis? Who qualifies for public office? Now, we do talk a lot today when we have politicians that we don't like in power. We say that they're unqualified. But we should take that with a grain of salt, because technically in a democracy, we do say that everybody really does qualify for public office. That's the whole point. It's open to all members of the society, every citizen. There might be a few restrictions, but in general, not that much. Right? And we don't say in general that in order to qualify for public office, you have to pass some kind of exam or something. And, sometimes people say we should or whatnot, but that would be quite a different system if we started doing that. In any case, but I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. So let's think about that principle. Really, if you did say something like that, which is what Plato says in the Republic, and I'm going to not use his exact terminology, but just imagine if you said something like, who qualifies for public office? What's the basis? If you only said, something, really smart people, that's it. Okay? The only people in your society, let's say, who qualify for the good, we're not worried about how to distribute it or anyway. We're just saying that the very principle, the basis of the distribution is really smart people. Now you might want to say, only people, only people with PhDs, right? That should get some people upset. But we could say something like that. Only people with PhDs, or only people who pass certain kinds of tests, or demonstrate, or whatever. I don't really care. But you would have to put some kind of content here as to what you mean by really smart people. So, some kind of intelligence thing or whatnot. And that was certainly Plato's idea. Think about it. In the Republic, who got to be the leader? Who was really in charge of the Republic, the ideal notion of a republic in Plato's work? The Republic? Well, it was the philosopher kings, right? Not a bad idea, but not exactly democratic, right? It wasn't just anybody. It was special people that were born, that had a certain kind of birth, and there was all kinds of restrictions that weren't under the individual's control, weren't under society's control. It was this sort of natural product. So you had the gold people, or whatever you want to call them. So if you have that the really smart people are the ones that are the only ones qualified, well, what's the manner of distribution? Well, there could be a variety of manners. They could be appointed so the smart people already could appoint more smart people. Smart people might say, okay, I want that other smart person to be in. Or it could be simply, of all the smart people, we just, we don't need all the smart people, so we have a manner of distribution that is, drawing of straws or something like that. So it could be random. But the point is that you're going to end up with a society that's run always by a subset, or maybe the whole set, of the smart people in that society. And that was Plato's idea. That's basically what you have. The smartest, the best of the best, the most intelligent people, the philosopher kings, should run it. And why did Plato think that? Well, that's a complicated question. But he thought that basically the smartest people will also be, ideally, the most virtuous. So you would get the best leaders, right? The people that are really smart and would end up running the show would be your most virtuous. And as a matter of fact, a truly virtuous leader doesn't really want to be a leader. Just does it in a sort of a sense of duty, does a good job, does the best of his or her. Plato was fine either way with that. But it would always be from that group. So it's clearly not a democracy. So in that sense, what is it? Well, it's an aristocracy. Right? So there you go. You have an aristocracy with Plato, and in that sense, you're going to it's going to be determined by the principle of distribution, not the manner, right? Because it could be a big aristocracy or a small one or whatnot, but it's still going to be an aristocracy no matter how you vary this, because you're never going outside that category from which to draw. So if you draw 10 of them or 100, or you randomly draw them, or you pick them according to, I don't know, their eye color within that group, it's still always going to be people from that group. So that's your result. Vary that as you will. That keeps it constant. So that's one way that we can see how the two principles play their roles and why this one is so important. So this is the big question whenever you're thinking about distribution, is who qualifies for it? Not necessarily how are we going to parcel it out in terms of actually distribute it, but who's going to begin the initial qualification. That's the key term. If you say something like, oh, no, not the really smart people. Well, we've seen other societies that really look different than this aristocracy, although there might be overlap. But let's say something like, no, the wealthy, the already powerful. Power should accrue to those who have it in the form of wealth. So wealthy people, right? We often hear people say stuff like that. Well, you know, if you had really wealthy people running the show, that would be a great thing, because wealthy people know the system because they've been able to work it to make money. So that would be a great thing. Have wealthy people running the show. And how would you talk about the manner? Again, could be appointed, random. So I'll just repeat that one. Appointed, random, etc., etc. Doesn't really matter. Or maybe only the top 1% of the top 1%, or something like that. The point is that it would always be drawn from this category of the wealthy. So what do you get when you do that? Well, if you say that only the wealthy people are going to run the show, you get what's often called an oligarchy. All right, so again, that's your number one, is this principle of distribution determining the form. You could vary that as you want, but you're still going to get an oligarchy out of the deal. It might be a slightly different kind of oligarchy, but it's still, you know, maybe you could say, well, there are different species of aristocratic governments and different species. Maybe this is a genus or whatever. Perhaps, but at the end of the day, it's still all within that family that we'll call the oligarchy. And then the last one is the principle of distribution. You say, well, what we like to think that we live in at the end of it all, when we really divorce ourselves from, you know, disliking a particular politician and saying, you know, maybe it's not a good thing to have a democracy, but basically we say something like this, well, really, we take it that the basis of the holding public office should not really be denied per se to anyone in virtue of something, let's say, that they're born, like things like skin color, eye color, or whatnot. Those kinds of things should not be factors, or how much money you have in the bank, or your last name. All these kinds of things, we would say, are irrelevant. They may be relevant in other situations. That's another discussion. But in terms of this discussion, who holds public office? In principle, everyone. Everyone at least qualifies. You know, and then you go through the process of trying to get elected or whatever. But at least it's not the case that anybody is automatically banned or barred from trying at least to hold public office, or disqualified on some grounds. So in that case, the manner, yeah, it might be important in a variety of ways, and we are arguing about that. For instance, in Canada, how do you elect it? Well, we have a certain way of capturing the vote, or a certain way of choosing people. We have a majoritarian system for trying to capture the will of the people. You could have proportional representation. Some people are arguing that we should shift to that, and there's all different ways. That is the manner of distributing this power that everyone at least qualifies for. So this, voting, and of course, as I said, this can go off in different directions. And again, as I mentioned earlier, You'll get a certain form based on your principle. Your manner is not really going to determine the form, but we could say, if we want to refine this a little bit, that the principle will determine sort of the genus, and maybe the manner will determine within that genus, that is, a particular species. So you'll have different species of democracy, maybe a direct or a proportional representation or a majoritarian system, depending on the manner that is, because you can vote in all different kinds of ways, and of course it's a big problem how to accurately capture the public wills through a vote. That can get surprisingly complex. Not complex to do the voting, but certainly the complexities arise in how you count these kinds of votes. All right, so there's sort of a rough overview of this notion of distributive justice. Again, Aristotle doesn't use that term. Parceling it out and how these certain principles come into play, and they will shape the kind of society that you have. And some principles this principle of distribution is arguably more important. And this one really tells you what genus you're in, and perhaps this one leads you to the notion of a species. Now, I just want to make a couple other comments which I think bring out a particular notion of Aristotle that's very important in terms of the broader picture, because you could ask, like, is Aristotle like sort of a liberal guy? No. Is he conservative? And if so, yeah, what kind or what not? Where does he fit on what we would call like the modern political spectrum? So a lot of the terms like right and left, those weren't around back then. Those come, centuries after Aristotle, those terms come around. But I just want to point out one of his discussions, and I'll end on that. Now, I mentioned earlier that for Plato, it was important to think of justice as having a connection to the kind of person or something about the person, right? And this also ties into notions of, treating people equally and fairly will not necessarily mean treating them identically. So once you open up that split between treating people equally and treating them identically, then all kinds of good stuff, and it's a little bit Pandora's box, because all kinds of problems come out, because how do you figure out, unequal treatment that's still fair, or non-identical treatment that would still qualify as treating them equally in the moral perspective. But for Aristotle, really, justice, similar to Plato, I think, I would make this argument, that justice really is to match people. So justice in this, again, in this distributive sense, and remember, we're still in the land of particular justice. So it's got this notion of a matching. That is, it's matching the people to the shares of the state. Matching citizens of the state. Like when we talk about shareholders, right? So the state is kind of like a giant sort of stockbroker in some way, parceling out the shares. And what the key thing that you're trying to do, and in Aristotle's, is you're not trying, as we would say today, the state is not out to pick winners and losers. The state is not really trying to make everything all equal in sort of a contemporary version, say, of a state that has a certain level playing field, or trying to do that. That really isn't what Aristotle's talking about. What Aristotle is saying is the citizens are matched to the shares of the state such that the status quo is preserved. So the state shouldn't run around parceling things out in the sense of trying to lift certain groups out of poverty and maybe tone down the wealth accumulation of others or things like that. Because in that sense, the state is picking winners and losers, right? And even though the winners may be doing fantastically, but just in the strict sense of picking winners and losers, Aristotle doesn't want the state to really have policies that are going to create winners and losers, which is pretty hard to do, because pretty well every policy, no matter what it is, creates winners and losers. Even if you have policies that tax the incredibly wealthy and give to the poor, to try and even things out a little bit, well, the losers are the people that end up paying more than they did, and the winners are the people that get a little bit. But that's only a relative comparison, because you can still make the argument of the so-called losers in this are still winning by far in the long run. But I'm just talking about the notion of within the relative effects of a policy. So what he's trying to do is that when the state does, though, so when does distribute goods, when the state does that, and Aristotle shows a little bit of a nod to mathematics in this, so no doubt from his teacher Plato. If you think about it, if you think of, let's say, A and B are people, in this sense, and we'll write up a couple of proportions here. So A and B are people, and C and D are shares, all right, what of good, of some good, whatever it happens to be. There's a certain kind of proportion that Aristotle wants to set up, that A is to B, as C is to D. Right? That proportion should be preserved in all these elements. So A, eventually what he's saying is that A is to C as B is to D. So what he's getting at in this discussion is that A plus C, okay, so the status of A plus the benefit, the share or whatever, has to still equal B plus D. So there's an arithmetic relationship Aristotle talks about here. When the state does intervene and get involved, it's an honest stockbroker. In that sense, it could make everyone better off, because A has now got C and B has now got D. But keep in mind that none of these values may actually be equal. It's their sum that's equal. So in that sense, if the state gets involved and makes some people better off, has to make everyone sort of better off in an arithmetic way such that things balance out. One of the ways it can make everybody better off, but it's always got the restriction that it's not supposed to pick winners and losers. So in other words, it is not it's kind of a moderate interventionist state, but it's very conservative in the sense that the outcomes really maintain the status quo. So the intervention that happens is really very modest. And by modest, I don't mean that it can't be much. These could be large amounts, right? But they're different. But at the end of it all, the large amounts that go in really maintain the status quo. So by modest, I mean maintain that status quo. So in that sense, it is quite a conservative state. It's conserving the relative positions. Yes, maybe everybody goes up a notch, or maybe everybody goes down a notch or two, but the notches are different, and where people end up can be different, but relatively speaking, they end up in the same relative positions to each other. So it's not a case of really going all out and picking winners and losers. So imagine if your government, every policy, they tried to balance it out such that it benefited groups accordingly, so that it always preserves. So yeah, some people might not live in quite as bad of condition, but those people that are raised a certain amount, others would have to be raised too, and they may be raised different amounts, so that the relative distance could be preserved. That may not exactly sit well with us today, or some of us, or some people might say, hey, that's exactly what the state should be doing. It should not in any way, when it intervenes, if it must intervene, it should not in any way be deciding these kinds of who gets more or whatever. It should just be reflecting what's already there. Well, if that's what you do, you're not really changing society, the relative positions within society, and that's why I would say it's more or less a fairly small c, not political party c, but a small c approach that we would call small c conservative. Okay, so that's it for chapter 3. In the next couple of chapters, we'll dive more deeply into more complex forms of justice and proportionality. See you in the next video.